Tony Chafer, Professor at Portsmouth University, has multiple PhDs, MAs, a colossal legacy of publications, mainly on France and Africa, a historian, a security expert, increasingly a comparativist as well, deputy chair of the Area Studies panel on this last time round, twice on the Area Studies panel, so rep expertise, and went into retirement, but fortunately for all of us has decided to rejoin the world of academia and has produced yet more material. And this particular article is a spin-off from a project that Tony and I did, funded by the Lever Hughes a number of years ago, and is, a very important matter for Europe and Africa. And I think I'll leave it at that. I haven't read
Thanks very much. That's very, very kind of you. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me today. So this is what I'm going to be talking about, particularly pertinent because it's something that's being covered a lot in the newspapers at the moment, is the failure of not just the French-led intervention in Mali now, but of course France has now been kicked out of both Niger and Burkina Faso as well. So this is a collaborative paper that I wrote with two colleagues, Eloise Bertrand and Ed Stoddard at Portsmouth, and it's based on field work that I did in Mali over a number of years. So that's the outline of the paper, that's the running order. So I'm going to first of all talk a little bit about the concept, utility, and we've introduced this corollary, disutility of force. I'm going to talk a bit about the French intervention in Mali, explore the French failure to adapt to the changing situation in Mali during the intervention from 2013 to 2023, and then also say a few words about the post-colonial context and how that made it more difficult for France to adapt its strategy. And then I'm going to finish by kind of standing back from the Mali case study and share some final thoughts about Western intervention failures, because there's been a history of those, of course, in recent years, going right back to Vietnam. So that's the presentation outline. The argument is what we're interested in is explaining why France, despite its material power relative to its enemies, failed in Mali. Quite clearly, France had much greater material, technical, military power relative to its enemies, but it still failed. And to explain this failure, what we do is we use the notion of the utility of force and advance a corollary, the disutility of force, to explore France's failures in Mali. The idea of the utility of force, popularised by the British General Rupert Smith in his 2005 book, refers not to the use of force, that's to say the types of forces and weapons systems deployed, but rather its usefulness. That is the political payoff derived from the use of armed force. According to Smith, in the increasingly prevalent new type of war that he calls war amongst the people, where a resolution cannot be achieved directly by military force, the utility of force often lies not in the destruction of the enemy, as in conventional war, but rather in creating a military condition that allows a conflict to be resolved by other non-military means. It's further argued that military action taking place among a population is inherently political, and winning is thus as much about the perception of third parties as it is about defeating the enemy in battle. This is especially important in counterinsurgency in counter-insurgency contexts, like Mali, where obtaining the support of the affected population is a key aim, something complicated in this case by the colonial legacies affecting France's relations with and the perception of France in Mali. In these circumstances, even a clear military victory may backfire if it is negatively perceived by the population. Now, in our view, the corollary of the utility of force is the strategically inappropriate use of force, which can, over time, create difficulties and what we call, we've introduced this term, the disutilities of force. So the strategically inappropriate use of force can, over time, create disutilities of force, which in turn actively create political and military setbacks that make reaching an acceptable political outcome harder. In such circumstances, misapplied strategy worsens the very situation it was intended to solve, as it not only fails to create a military condition that allows the conflict to be resolved through other means, but also creates military and non-military dynamics that militate against the resolution of the conflict. So when an actor is creating disutilities of force, which is what we argue happened here, when it's creating disutilities of force, the harder it pushes, the more resources it deploys, and the longer it deploys them for, the worse the situation becomes. So, why did the French military intervention make things worse? Well, these are some of the arguments, summary of some of the key arguments we're going to make. First of all, the shifting pattern of the jihadist insurgency in the country. Secondly, the failure of France and the assemblage of actors led by France failed to change in the face of an evolving insurgency. And thirdly, in a conspiracy-fueled post-colonial context, these strategic failures compounded over time, leading to what we have called the disutility of force. So that's the basic outline of the argument that I want to make. So let's start then with the French intervention in Mali. French President François Hollande launched Operation Serval on the 11th of January 2013. France's 3,500 troops, accompanied by 2,000 Chadian soldiers, recaptured all the major population centres in a matter of weeks, leading President Hollande to announce the operation's successful completion in July 2014. From a military point of view, Serval was almost a classical war, insofar as there was an identifiable enemy, the violent Islamist groups allied with the Tuareg separatists, the MNLA, that could be directly defeated. With the territorial defeat of these groups, the deployment of force had thus demonstrated its core utility, the destruction and removal of the enemy. This victory, however, was illusory. What remained of these groups dispersed into the centre of Mali and neighbouring countries. And this led France to transform Operation Serval into a more ambitious regional operation, Barkhane, in August 2014. It recast French military actions in the region as a wide-ranging counter-terrorism operation targeting violent Islamist groups, with its theatre of operations stretched across 5 countries: Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. Barkhane's aim was twofold: to support the armed forces of the participating countries in their efforts to contain the activities of armed groups, and to help national armies to rebuild so that they could take over counter-terrorist operations from French forces and prevent the re-establishment of terrorist sanctuaries in the region. Now, following the success of Operation Serval, as we've just seen, these groups dispersed across the region and in many cases embedded themselves within the population. This led to a strategic shift, as they adopted a form of population-centric insurgency. Groups such as Katiba Masina progressively pursued a twin approach which consisted in embedding themselves in existing socio-political grievances between ethnic groups in central Mali and in presenting themselves as the defenders of the Fulani community. For example, by connecting their own jihad to the historical Fulani jihad of Sekou Amadou in the 19th century. Islamic State, also present in the country, also adopted a similar approach of ingratiating themselves with Fulani populations, offering a mixture of basic but nonetheless valued services, given that the government was no longer providing these services, and coercion for those who do not work with them. This engendered a complex, quasi-protective, quasi-exploitative relationship with the population. This population-centric approach can best be described as revolutionary warfare, a mixture of guerrilla tactics combined with a strategy built on political subversion. In such circumstances, the utility of guerrilla violence is not to hold ground or to defeat opposing forces in battle, as in conventional warfare, nor to amplify a political statement, as in terrorism, but rather to create the physical and political space for the subversion of society. This is why militants, including Katiba Masina and Islamic State, target both prominent leaders and representatives of the state who challenge their legitimacy, as well as military and UN forces who physically challenge their presence. Now, of course, an insurgency's focus on the population does not mean that it is benign, nor that it treats all civilians well. Katiba Masina and Islamic State are violent to those they perceive as cooperating with their enemies, and have exacerbated conflicts with Dogon and to a lesser extent Bambara communities, fueling violence against the Fulanis. These groups, the armed groups, then present themselves as protectors of the Fulani communities. But of course this is often from violence that they have themselves helped to trigger. So, the French strategy. The security challenges facing Barkhane in 2014 were very different from those faced by Operation Serval in 2013. By then, by 2014, as we've seen, the armed groups had mostly dissolved into the population in the centre of Mali and in neighbouring countries. Barkhane thus now faced a conflict more akin to a localised insurrection and intercommunal conflict than to either a conventional war or terrorism. It therefore required a concept of operations closer to counterinsurgency, in which providing support to the population is crucial to insulate them from the insurgent groups and to ensure peaceful relations between communities. However, rather than isolate the militants and protect the targeted communities, Barkhane's strategy was to directly pursue the armed groups wherever they were operating across the Sahel region, thus maintaining a counter-terrorist approach. The problem was that this yielded minimal security payoff. The neutralisation, to use the French military's favoured term, of prominent combatants, such as Abdelmalek Drukdel, the head of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and Abu Walid al-Sarawi, the head of Islamic State in Mali, the neutralisation, killing, of these leaders brought no obvious improvement to the human security situation. So by 2017, it was clear that France's approach was not working, as the security situation was continuing to get worse. The election of Emmanuel Macron to the presidency in May 2017 therefore prompted some shifts in the French approach, driven by Macron's fear that France was getting bogged down in the region with no obvious exit strategy. First, Macron actively promoted the creation of the G5 Sahel Joint Force, a regional task force comprising troops from 5 countries involved in the G5 Sahel, namely Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. The objective was to build up the joint force so that it could take over cross-border counter-terrorist operations from the French Operation Barkhane, thus allowing France to pull back from frontline military operations. Second, increasingly recognising the logistical challenge of operating across a vast area and difficult terrain, nearly twice the size of Western Europe, and remember there's only 5,000 of them, the French forces reviewed the scope of their operation and sought to rely more on other actors. So from 2017, they decided to concentrate their military efforts on the so-called Three Borders Zone, which is illustrated there, between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And this was the area where Islamic State was particularly active. At the same time, they increasingly cooperated with other actors, including the Malian armed forces, as well as with self-defense militias, which by this time were working with the Malian government in the fight against Islamic State. Thirdly, while Barkhane had the military power to wrest control of territory from armed groups, they did not have sufficient troops on the ground to hold that territory once they left to take on armed groups in another area. France thus relied on other actors, notably the Malian armed forces and the UN force MINUSMA, to provide protection and services to the populations of these areas, in a kind of division of labour, where French forces and the Malian armed forces undertook counter-terrorism actions, while the UN was responsible for peacekeeping. Except, of course, that there was no peace to keep, and MINUSMA did not have sufficient resources to hold areas that French forces had liberated from the control of the armed groups. As a result, the armed groups simply moved back in when French troops left. Meanwhile, the well-documented human rights violations, mainly against Fulani communities, committed by the Malian armed forces and the self-defense groups working with them, ran against the armed forces' mandate to protect local populations. Indeed, both the militias and the Malian armed forces targeted civilians for their perceived support for militants, rather than helping to protect them from predatory armed groups. This prevented the expected stabilisation of conflict-affected communities, and has been one of the drivers that pushed some Fulani to join the armed groups, who were offering protection against the army and pro-state militias. Barkhane's cooperation with the Malian armed forces and the local militias also harmed the way France and its international partners were perceived by local populations, delegitimizing Barkhane and, by association, its international partners, who were seen as at best irrelevant to and at worst complicit in these violent dynamics. Now, another actor that was supposed to, if you like, fill in this population protection gap in the French strategy was the European Union. The European Union was supposed to help fill the population protection gap, for example, through its EU capacity building missions in both Mali and Niger. However, EU agencies were under-resourced for the scale of the task and hampered by short mandates and frequent staff turnover, making it impossible to develop long-term, locally grounded strategies. In addition, competition between EU actors over project implementation impeded their effectiveness. Further problems of coordination resulted from the fact that stakeholders in Brussels and those on the ground had diverging views and priorities. Competition and leadership struggles among these stakeholders harmed both coordination and implementation. So what we have now is a French strategy which is still focusing on the military, but where the military counter-terrorist side, but relying on other actors to do, if you like, the population protection work. So in summary, the French strategy in Mali did not adapt successfully to the changing nature of the conflict it now faced. But why? Firstly, changing direction once overall strategy has been agreed is never easy. The process of bringing together the many political and military actors involved, in this case at both national and international level, to establish an agreed strategy and deliver it, takes time and is far from straightforward. A change of strategy is thus difficult, not least because to do so could be seen as an admission of the failure of the original strategy. And this was compounded also by the multiplicity of actors involved and the lack of coordination between them. As we've seen, France was relying on other actors, the Malian state, MINUSMA, the UN forces, EU initiatives, to deliver the population-centric elements of the strategy. But as we've also seen, these actors faced major challenges in their ability to deliver this part of the strategy. And the Malian government lacked the political will to do so. Secondly, attention emerged between short-term objectives, making quick counter-terrorist wins, such as taking out armed group leaders of the armed groups, and pulling French troops out, and the long-standing objectives of the French intervention to facilitate the reassertion of Malian state sovereignty across the country and bring peace and stability to the region. This tension was even harder to disentangle, considering the human rights violations being perpetrated by the Malian armed forces and the militias working with them. The tactical decision by the French forces to support certain armed groups as part of the fight against terrorism meant in effect accepting, or at least turning a blind eye to, human rights abuses. But this then, of course, undermined the overarching strategic goal of defeating the insurgency. Meanwhile, the level of evidence required to restrain and pressure a partner government, here the Malian government, and the level of evidence required to restrain and pressure a partner, and the level of political capital expended in order to do so, is very high, especially as this would open France to further accusations of neo-colonialism and quite quickly deteriorate the relationship between France and Mali. Moreover, highlighting their abuses and the mistakes they made, or placing significant public pressure on the Malian armed forces, would signal that the French strategy to leave was flawed. It would also have the effect of widening the gap between France's exit strategy on the one hand and Barkhane's on-the-ground objective of containing the insurgency and taking out its leaders on the other. So what we have then, basically what I'm arguing here is that the French failure to adapt was linked to particular path dependencies which made it difficult to achieve the adaptation necessary. There are other reasons, because there were, which I'm not going to go into now, but we can talk about those in the discussion if you want. But there were very different perspectives between the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defence about what strategy was needed. I just want to say a few words now before I finish on the post-colonial legacy. As we've seen, France was constrained in how far it could push the Malian government to act by its status as the former colonial power. At the same time, the failure of the French-led intervention to improve security for the majority of the population, despite the military resources at its disposal and its history of colonial domination, were increasingly perceived by Malians, as time went on, as surprising, and suggested to many that France was, at best, not trying very hard, or, at worst, actively assisting the armed groups. The perceived supremacy of France, derived from its colonial past and its military superiority over African states, shaped popular expectations towards the French intervention. In the popular imagination, then, it was hard to fathom how a country that had controlled the whole region through a system of colonial rule could now fail to quell a few thousand jihadists. It was difficult to believe that Barkhane and the UN forces of MINUSMA, given the considerable means at their disposal, were incapable of reducing the harmful power of armed terrorist groups, or at least of protecting them against these groups. So, 10 years after the launch of Operation Serval, Barkhane left the country without having achieved its objectives and leaving behind no tangible improvement in the security context as the cycle of violence continues in Mali and continues to spread across the region. So what I want to do now, just to finish off then, is just to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture of asymmetric wars between strong state and weak non-state actors. Of course, France is not the first Western power to lose an expeditionary war. Indeed, it's fairly common for Western powers to withdraw from overseas interventions without having achieved their strategic goals. Such circumstances are sometimes referred to as strategic defeats, because while Western states rarely lose battles on the ground and are seldom thwarted tactically and operationally, they lose these wars at the strategic level by essentially giving up or being forced to give up. The reasons for the eventual failure of the stronger side in such asymmetric Western expeditionary wars over past decades, from Vietnam to Somalia, from Iraq to Afghanistan, are fairly well explored and understood. General explanations of Western strategic failure focus on, firstly, misapplied strategy, where stronger Western states apply the wrong type of conventional military-centric strategy against guerrilla insurgencies. Guerrilla and insurgent strategies rarely present a serious military threat that can defeat Western powers, but they can often survive and even thrive nonetheless. The second explanation that's been put forward focuses on mismatched resolve, described as interest asymmetry. Here, accounts focus on how such wars generate domestic pressures that cause Western states to eventually withdraw. And the third type of explanation focuses on external assistance in the form of weapons, money, troops, safe areas, and so on, that helps level the playing field, meaning the conflicts are not as asymmetric as they might at first appear in practice. And often all these three factors can play a role simultaneously. So to come back to the paper today, in the case of France, our paper offers an account that links up with the first two of these explanations. Firstly, France's military operations were misaligned with the conflict and the strategy of the jihadist armed groups, with the disutilities of force making this situation worse over time. Reflecting the second explanation, Macron was set on withdrawal after coming to power, and the combination of a lack of success and pressure to end France's role drove internal domestic pressure to withdraw. It's worth noting, however, that there was also very significant pressure from within Mali for France to withdraw. The explanation about mismatched resolve usually tends to focus more on democratic constraints from within the intervening states, whereas our analysis shows how popular pressures and subsequently the populist moves of non-democratic leaders can also interplay with strategic failures on the part of the intervening power to generate significant pressure for withdrawal. And this is especially pronounced, as we've seen in post-colonial contexts, where France has little legitimacy to push back against demands for withdrawal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. This is an important topic. Obviously, you've come at the very end of the semester when people are not around, but the diehards who have very kindly come along today may have some...
Thank you very much for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming. Does anybody want to kick off with a question? I mean, we recognise that most people are not experts in this field, so we can have a question from any kind of angle on this.
Yeah, I guess more a conceptual question about when I'm not familiar with the concept of utilities of force, or therefore kind of the disutilities of force. But I wonder if you could expand a bit more on both those and
Yeah, I mean the utility of force is actually quite widely used by military historians, military analysts, security studies people to, if you like, move beyond just thinking about what force is used, so what weapons are deployed, what military equipment is deployed, the technical side. We're trying to think about the usefulness of force, how it's deployed in these new types of asymmetric war. How can force be deployed usefully? And Rupert Smith and one or two other analysts, they talk about this concept of war among the population, and it's a much more complex war then, because if you're among the population, there's particularly for Western forces, which are supposed to be abiding by international humanitarian law and so on and so forth. There are limits on how much collateral damage you can perpetrate before criticisms kick in, before domestic audiences, domestic public opinion start to ask questions about what we're doing, before international NGOs intervene and so on and so forth. So that's essentially what that's essentially what Rupert Smith and his colleagues are talking about. He's obviously a British general, he's a military man, so he's particularly interested in how this force can better be deployed usefully. Mm-hmm. What we've done is we've taken the opposite of that. These commentators don't use the concept of disutility of force, but we've kind of introduced the counter concept, if you like, of the disutility of force, where what we're showing in the Malian case, and I think it's a concept that could be used in other contexts as well. It occurs to me it could possibly be used in the context of Israel and Palestine at the moment, for example. That our idea of the disutility of force is that actually it not only doesn't improve the security situation, but actually it makes the conflict dynamics worse. That the intervener, who probably initially at least saw themselves as a kind of neutral broker trying to come in and stabilise the situation and provide security, actually becomes an actor in the situation or perceived as an actor in the situation, taking sides. And what then happens is that the conflict, because you're exacerbating the kind of underlying causes of the conflict then actually becomes more intractable and more difficult to resolve. And the longer you stay, the more resources you throw at it, the more difficult it becomes. You're actually going, this is why we use disutility of force, you're actually going, the outcome is actually the opposite of what you wanted, because you're actually making the situation worse. And our argument is that that's exactly what happened in the case of the French intervention in Mali from 2013 to 2022. That the intervention has actually ended up, and we're still seeing this now, I mean the situation is still getting worse. 1.2 million people displaced. I mean, you know, compared to Ukraine and compared to Gaza, it's had no coverage at all in the media. There are no journalists or anything there. But thousands of people have been killed. We don't know exactly how many have been displaced, but it now looks as though it's up to 1.2, possibly 1.5 million people have been displaced. And there's no solution in sight. So if you like, the utility of force has become quite widely used as a concept. Our contribution is, if you like, to introduce this opposite, the disutility of force, where the deployment of force in these wars among the people actually make the situation worse rather than, and more difficult to solve rather than improving.
Question, I saw you took some notes. Do you have any question at all? Feel free to ask if you want.
No. Thank you.
Just, I'd like to understand the core of this issue. The intervention, the reason for intervention is quite understandable. What I'm struggling to understand is what is the reason for the rise of jihadists in that part of the continent? Why? And second, we pretend that we can address issues in our own way, Western way. We are ignoring existing local institutions, I believe, that are capable of addressing certain issues. We are ignoring their presence. We are just pushing our own agenda, and we lose. So what is your intake? What is the cause of the rise of jihadists in that part of the continent? Even in other parts, even the eastern part of the continent, it's happening nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other paper. In fact, it's probably a book that we could write on on that. I mean, there are a number of different reasons. I mean, the rise of jihad in countries like Mali and across the Western Sahel generally, I mean, some people trace back to the 1970s, 1980s, and the arrival of particularly religious leaders and preachers from Pakistan, and moving to the region and preaching a different form of Islam from what was there before, which I think is probably true, and certainly there's a lot of money come from, particularly from Saudi Arabia, but also from Kuwait, building new mosques and so on and so forth. But that, that if you like, is religious jihad. It's not necessarily violent. It's preaching, promoting a more pure, if you like, in their new form of Islam, but it's not necessarily violent. What caused the the shift to violence? Well, you may remember back in the 1990s there was a long-running civil war in Algeria, which was eventually defeated by the Algerian government. But quite a number of those fighters moved into northern Mali, and that disturbed the kind of political dynamics in the north of Mali. And then the French and the British had the bright idea of overthrowing Gaddafi in 2011. And Gaddafi's presidential guard was made up largely of Tuareg from the north of Niger, the north of Mali, and so on. So when Gaddafi was assassinated, these members of his presidential guard all returned home with lots of weapons, including heavy weapons. The weapons that they had in Libya, they took back with them. So you now had a combination of long-running separatist movement in the north of the country, in the north of Mali, which had long-standing economic and political grievances. They didn't, I mean, you know, the north of Mali is up here, and Bamako, the capital's down here. It's several thousand miles away, and they just felt left behind, ignored, marginalised, etc., etc., etc. And it was a separatist movement that was generating more and more kind of support. And then you've got this massive influx of arms and fighters, well-trained fighters, coming to the country. And that was a trigger, really. That was the trigger, and they then started to move south in December 2012, and that led to the French intervention. The Malian government panicked and asked the French to intervene. The French intervened, took these fighters on, defeated them. In that sense, Serval was a successful operation. But of course, as I said in the paper, the defeat was illusory, because these people, they were defeated in battle, but they now spread out across the region, and they spread into the centre of Mali, which was hitherto unaffected largely by what was going on. And this provided, a setting in which the armed groups could, basically, in embedding themselves within the population, they exploited rivalries and long-standing conflicts, particularly between, for example, pastoralists and farmers, because in the context of changing climate, usable land is becoming more and more scarce. So there's always been conflicts between herders and farmers, but they were exacerbated. The armed groups were able to embed themselves in and present themselves as protectors of the Fulani, the pastoralists, against the farmers. See, what you're getting there, what I'm painting there, is a spiral. It's getting worse and worse. And the French forces intervening into that, they're not perceived as neutral brokers. They become actors in the conflict. Or they come to be perceived as actors in the conflict. And I didn't talk about this, but another reason that they failed was that increasingly the armed groups attacked the French forces and the UN forces, so that at any one time, 60% of the UN forces, and sometimes more, and 60% of the French forces were involved in force protection. Okay? So you've got 5,000 troops, 60% of those are involved in force protection. That doesn't leave many people across the territory twice the size of Western Europe for stabilisation efforts, for peacekeeping operations. So yeah, I mean, that's a kind of long answer to your question of why. I would say if you want me to put a finger on an immediate trigger, it was the Anglo-French intervention in Libya in 2011. That was the immediate trigger of the whole thing. What was your second question? I can't remember now.
Basically, that was literally why not using, long-lasting, existing internal conflict resolution ways. There are a lot in the continent. We are ignoring them. And I think not only the West, people from let's say from Africa are not well aware of the existence of those internal institutions.
Yeah.
They are ignored as if they are backward, they are not modern, and they are trying to modernize rather than, making it functional in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And unless otherwise we are tapping into that cultural heritage of a society, I think winning not only the war, the battle will be a difficult challenge.
I mean, the original Operation Serval was actually basically a success. I mean, they defeated the armed insurrection that was driving, heading for Bamako, which panicked the Bamako. I mean, I don't think they would ever have been capable of taking over Bamako, but anyway, the Bamako government, transitional government at the time, panicked and asked the French to intervene. What they should have done was leave. Once they'd done that was what they came for. That's what they should have done. They should have left. Because there's an inherent problem. If a force of liberation, which was how the French forces were perceived in early 2013, if a force of liberation stays on, it's not very long before it becomes to be seen as a force not of liberation but of occupation. And this became a regular theme that became increasingly heard within Malian society, that they're infringing our sovereignty. The first president of Mali, when Mali became independent in 1960, unlike several of the other former French colonies, refused any French military presence and refused any French military bases in Mali. And yet here they were in 2014 now, with France installing military bases for this regional operation across the region. What more could I say?
It's only a question of time. I may ask one last question. If somebody else wants to come in with another question, they can. I suppose, I agree with everything you've said. I think your analysis is absolutely right. And I know from looking at surveys that a lot of Malians felt that these forces were all about protecting themselves and not so much about protecting the local population.
But of course there's a lot of truth in that.
And there was a lot of truth in that, and some also winning hearts and minds can be difficult when you're going out to see villages and you're in full body armour as well. It doesn't really inspire confidence.
Well, that's impossible when most of your troops are confined to a bunker.
Exactly. So that limits the ability. But my question, I suppose, links to: are you viewing this utility as a kind of binary notion, or it's either because of course it's much more fluid than that, because if you look at it in a granular form over time, you have the utility of force turning into the disutility of force.
That's right, yeah.
And also, if you imagine that the French, when they went in, and imagine that MINUSMA and the EU were effective operations and doing what they were supposed to do, stabilise, develop, train, and do it correctly. In fact, do it as effectively as France was neutralising terrorists. Right? Then you would have to take your marker and work out, well, is this disutility of force, or is the disutility of force arising to a certain extent, if not to a large extent, out of the inadequacies of the other actors to enable a force-led strategy? Or is, and so that's one explanation, but the other explanation could be that actually using force was never really a flyer anyway, because if you come back to the whole start of the conflict, France was viewed as too close to the Tuaregs as well, and not a neutral party, and therefore any exertion of force was almost by definition going to exacerbate that idea. So I don't know where you stand on the making this even more granular, because you obviously mentioned the Gaza thing. I mean, I think that is possibly the clearest example you could ever have of the disutility of force. You know, what they're doing in Gaza. How do you misapply force in a more effective way than that? I mean, it's hard to believe, you know. But how granular do you see this? How do you see it? You know, how do you measure over time, I suppose, utility becoming disutility and so on? It's a hard question.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important and really interesting question, because it kind of goes to the heart of what this paper's about, is where, you know, at what point does the utility tip over into disutility? At what point can you say that that utility has tipped over into disutility? And I mean, I think the first thing is that you have to say that there isn't a single answer to that, because it will always be context specific. And I think, you know, one of the other arguments that we do develop in the paper is that, or we do mention in the paper, we don't have a chance to develop it because of the word limit, but one of the things that we do mention in the paper is the importance of context sensitivity, because what you also find within interventions, Western interventions, is that they're often driven by kind of what are seen as either universal solutions or learning lessons from the previous conflict. But of course the previous conflict, Afghanistan, Iraq, was different. So the move, if you like, from utility to disutility is going to be different, and is going to be driven by different forces in each situation. So I think, you know, one thing that you could do, if you think that the disutility of force is potentially a useful tool, you can take it to these other conflicts and then compare and contrast that, if you like, trajectory of utility versus disutility. And I think that would be an interesting, you know, that would be an interesting way of kind of going to the next stage with this article, with this paper, for example. So it's kind of a non-answer to your question.
No, I think that's right. I mean, it prepares the ground for, you know, how do you measure in terms of reception. I mean, if you go back to the Gaza-Israel thing, I mean, you could see that there was the utility of force in the first week, maybe, of that conflict. Maybe some kind of reaction was required, but that utility quickly expired. So the time frame for utility in that conflict would seem to be extremely limited.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things I said at the beginning of the paper is that in these kinds of types of wars, which Smith and others call wars amongst the people, winning is about perceptions.
That's right.
And you know what you've just said, that perceptions change very quickly from in relation to what was happening in Gaza. this wasn't a matter of years. This was a matter of weeks. So yeah.
Now, time's up, but you're
Oh, no,
if you've got a question.
Well, it was just, I guess, to expand on, well, it's not directly related, but I'm just very interested to hear what you think, is going to happen in the Gaza-Israel situation as a kind of expert on this, on militarism. The disutility idea is that they have made it way, way worse. Israel is not even achieving its own strategic objectives, I guess, is it?
And arguably it can't. It's actually, and that was one of the problems for France here, is that the strategic objective was never actually very clear. Apart from it was the war on terror, but it was unwinnable. You couldn't do it, and the more they stayed, the more things got worse. I'm not an expert on Israel-Palestine at all, but I feel that there's a kind of similar dynamic at work. That the more that they throw at the problem, their perception of the problem, the more that they throw at it, the more they're losing international support. And they're also driving, one guarantee from what's going on is that you're driving generations of Palestinians to support Hamas. So
there seems to be a problem in the oversimplification of the mission. What is the mission? And they didn't know in France what the mission, so they focused on counter-terrorism, neutralisation, all these terms. War on terror is a good example. Eliminate the threat of Hamas and so on. It seems to be that in order to sell the message, they probably have to make it so simple. But the message or the mission is therefore unachievable, because that simplicity